She had never believed in love. Not once. Not even close. Clara Whitmore had built her entire life on a single principle her mother pressed into her like a brand when she was 9 years old. The moment you need someone, you lose. And Clara Whitmore did not lose. She sat at the head of a 42nd floor boardroom in downtown Chicago. A city that moved the way she moved, fast, loud, and without apology, and she surveyed the room the way a general surveys a battlefield. 11 executives. 11 people who had prepared their reports, polished their slides, rehearsed their talking points. She listened to exactly 4 minutes of the first presentation before setting down her coffee cup with a quiet, deliberate click. "Restart," she said. That was all. No explanation, no softening. The presenter, a 45-year-old man with 2 graduate degrees, pulled up slide 1 without a word. Clara Whitmore was 32. She was the chief executive of Whitmore Dynamics, a mid-sized but fiercely ambitious technology company her father had founded 30 years ago and she had rebuilt almost entirely from scratch. She had taken the helm at 26 after her father's sudden departure from the business, turned 3 consecutive years of losses into a record-breaking profit margin, and expanded the company's AI development division into 4 new markets in 18 months. She wore her dark hair pulled tight. She wore heels that added 3 inches to a frame that already didn't need them. She wore, always, the same expression, composed, assessing, a fraction short of warm. People in the industry called her brilliant. People who had worked for her called her terrifying. Both groups were right. She kept her desk obsessively clear. No photographs, no personal items, nothing that could be read as sentiment. Her assistant once placed a small plant on the corner of her desk, a modest, unoffending succulent, and Clara moved it to the hallway table by the end of the day without a word of explanation. She did not apologize for her coldness. She did not see it as coldness. She saw it as precision. What almost nobody knew about Clara Whitmore was that she had once been a girl who waited by the door. A girl who rehearsed what she would say when her father came home, who picked wildflowers from the yard and left them in a cup by the kitchen window where he would see them, who fell asleep in the armchair by the front door 3 nights in a row before her mother finally sat her down and said, in the quiet, steady voice of a woman who had already finished grieving, "He's not coming back, Clara, and we don't need him to." Her mother, Eleanor Whitmore, had worked 2 jobs to keep the house and put Clara through school. She had been extraordinary. She had also been, by necessity, made of granite. And somewhere along the way, Clara had absorbed every lesson her mother taught, including the ones Eleanor never meant to teach, that softness was weakness, that needing someone was the first step toward being left behind, that the only reliable thing in the world was what you built with your own hands. By the time Clara was a teenager, she had stopped waiting by the door. By the time she was 20, she had stopped believing anyone waited for anything at all. By 26, she ran a company, and love, that imprecise, ungovernable thing, had never made it past the lobby. So when her Aunt Patricia called one Thursday evening and said, in the cheerful tone of someone who thought they were doing something wonderful, "Clara, I've arranged a dinner. There's someone I want you to meet," Clara said yes. Not because she was interested, not because some corner of her wanted to be. She said yes because she had learned long ago that agreeing and then walking away was faster than arguing. She would go. She would be polite. She would leave early. And she would spend the rest of the weekend catching up on the quarterly projections her CFO had left on her desk. The restaurant was a quiet Italian place on the north side, good food, modest lighting, the kind of place that didn't try too hard. Clara arrived exactly on time, which for her meant she was already 2 minutes ahead of schedule. She smoothed her coat, adjusted her watch, and pushed through the door, and then she stopped. At the table near the window, a man sat with a small girl, no older than 8. The girl was wearing a yellow sweater and had 2 braids tied with white ribbons. She was coloring something in a small notebook. The man was watching her with an expression Clara had no word for: steady, full, unhurried, like someone who had nowhere else to be, and considered that a gift. He was not what Clara had imagined. He was tall but lean, with calloused hands and a face that had spent time in the weather. He was wearing a clean blue shirt and dark jeans, and there was nothing wrong with any of it, but there was also nothing that announced itself. He looked up when she approached. He smiled. "You must be Clara," he said. "I'm Daniel. And this is Lily." Daniel Brooks was 37 years old. He ran a one-man auto repair shop in a suburb 40 minutes outside the city. He had never finished his bachelor's degree. He had dropped out in his junior year when his wife, Maya, was diagnosed with a rare neurological condition that moved fast and left nothing behind. He had spent 2 years as her caretaker, her advocate, her constant. And then, 3 years ago, she had died. He had been left with a mortgage he could barely cover, a business he had inherited from his own father, and a daughter who asked every few weeks, in the way children ask the hardest questions, whether Daddy was sad. He always told her the same thing: "I'm good, Bug. I'm really good." He was not always good, but he was always there. Clara sat down. She ordered water. She opened the menu. She was already conducting the interview in her head, not because she cared about the answers, but because she wanted to reach the end of the evening efficiently. She asked about his work. He told her, simply, without embarrassment. She asked where he lived. He told her. She asked about his daughter's school. He said Lily went to the public school 2 blocks from the shop, and that her teacher said she had a gift for reading. Lily, at this point, looked up from her coloring and said, "I read 43 books last year." Daniel said, "44. Lily said, "The dinosaur one was too short," and for one unguarded second, Clara almost smiled. She caught it. She put it away. What Clara Whitmore was doing, underneath the politeness, was calculating, and what her calculation produced was this: a man with no degree, no assets, no connections, living in the outer suburbs on a mechanic's income, raising a child alone. A man whose life was, by every metric she had ever been taught to use, the opposite of her own. She set her menu down. She looked at him directly, the way she looked at proposals she was about to reject. "Daniel," she said, "I'm going to be honest with you. You seem like a genuinely decent person." She paused. "But you're not someone who belongs in my world." The table went quiet. Daniel held her gaze. He didn't flinch, didn't color, didn't look away. He just looked at her the way you look at someone who has said something that reveals more about them than they intended. Lily had stopped coloring. The yellow crayon sat still in her hand. Clara stood. She thanked him for coming. She left $40 on the table for the drinks she'd ordered, and she walked out into the night air of a city that was loud and indifferent and exactly as she preferred it. She did not look back. She did not think, at that moment, that she had done anything wrong. She had simply been accurate. She had described reality as she understood it, and she had spared them both from a future that would never have worked. That was what she told herself. Standing in the cold outside the restaurant, she told herself she had been efficient and kind in her own way, and that the right decision often felt like nothing at all. She did not know, yet, that Daniel Brooks was still sitting at that table, that he had waited until Lily was focused on her coloring again before he said, quietly, to no one in particular, "There are things worth more than money. She just hasn't met the right person to teach her that yet." He said it without bitterness, without performance, just the plainest truth he knew. What happened in the weeks after their dinner was this. Clara forgot Daniel Brooks almost entirely. She had a company to run, and running it left very little room for anything else. She approved a new infrastructure contract on Monday, fired a department head on Tuesday, flew to San Francisco on Wednesday for a partnership meeting, and returned Thursday to a 17-page briefing on their next-generation product rollout. Daniel Brooks lived somewhere in her peripheral memory, the way a briefly glanced detail lives present but unprocessed. Filed somewhere that required no action. What happened in those same weeks for Daniel was different. His days had a rhythm that was both exhausting and precise. He woke before 6, made Lily's lunch while she slept, walked her to school at 7:40, opened the shop at 8, and worked through the morning on whatever had come in brake jobs, oil changes, the occasional engine that needed something more. At noon, If there was no rush, he sat outside the shop on an old metal chair and ate a sandwich. His neighbor, Mrs. Callahan, had started leaving for him 3 years ago, after Maya died, as though she had decided this small act was hers to perform indefinitely. At 3, he picked up Lily. At 5, they cooked dinner together. She stirred things. He chopped things. They talked about the day. By 8, she was in bed, and he read to her until she was asleep. Then he changed his shirt, got in his truck, and drove to Riverside Gardens Assisted Living, 20 minutes east. He had been going there for 4 years. It had started simply enough: a customer, an older gentleman who had brought in a car with a carburetor problem and stayed talking for 2 hours because, as he put it, "No one talks to me much anymore." Daniel had listened. He always listened. The old man's name was William. He came back the following week. Not with a car problem, just to talk. Daniel made 2 cups of coffee, and they sat in the shop and talked about baseball and weather and things that had mattered once. A few months later, William had moved into Riverside Gardens, and Daniel had started visiting. Just once a week. Then twice. Then, in the last year, nearly every night. He never told anyone about it. It was not a story he told. He went. He sat. He listened. He drove home. In his mind, it was simply the right thing to do, and things that were simply right did not require announcement. This was, perhaps, the thing about Daniel Brooks that was hardest to understand for someone like Clara. That goodness, for him, was not a performance and not a strategy. It was just the default, the baseline, the thing he returned to when everything else was stripped away. William Whitmore was 81 years old. He was a man who had built a company, walked away from a marriage, lost his daughter's childhood, and spent the last 3 decades accumulating the specific kind of regret that money cannot spend its way out of. He had funded his own comfortable existence at Riverside Gardens without telling a single member of the staff who he was, what he owned, or what he had once been. He had a small room with a window that faced a garden. He had a framed photograph on his nightstand, a little girl of about 6, holding a wildflower, squinting into the sun. Clara. He had not spoken to her in 11 years. Daniel did not know any of this for a long time. William was simply William, a sharp, funny, occasionally difficult old man who liked chess and hated decaf coffee and had opinions about every major geopolitical event of the past 60 years. They played chess 3 nights a week. Daniel won maybe 1 game in 5, which William considered acceptable. On the other nights, they sat and talked, or William told stories, or they watched baseball on the small television in the corner with the volume low, so as not to disturb the hallway. One night, William set his chess piece down and looked at Daniel in the particular way he sometimes did, considering, measuring, and asked, "If you had everything tomorrow, money, security, everything, would you change?" Daniel thought about it seriously. The way Daniel thought about everything. "The only thing I want," he said finally, "is for Lily to have more choices than I did. That's all. Not for me. Just for her." William looked at the board for a long moment. "I had everything," he said quietly, "and I still managed to lose the only thing that mattered." He didn't explain. He didn't need to. It was 6 weeks before William told Daniel the truth. He told him on a Tuesday in October. When the garden outside the window had gone the color of rust, he told him about Whitmore Dynamics, and the marriage he had failed, and the daughter he had left. He told him that Clara was the girl in the photograph, that she had grown up to be extraordinary, and that he knew this only because he had watched from a distance, never announcing himself, never knowing what he would say if he did. He told him that he had tried, once, to reach out, and that she had not responded, and that he had decided he had no right to try again. Daniel listened to all of it, without interruption. When William was finished, he said, "You still have time." William shook his head slowly. "I have weeks," he said, "maybe less." And then he said the thing that would stay with Daniel for the rest of his life. I don't need her forgiveness. I've made my peace with what I did. What I want is for someone to remember me as more than a name on a company." He paused. "You already do, son." The words sat between them. Daniel didn't point it out. He just nodded, and they went back to the chess game. William Whitmore died on a quiet Saturday morning in November, with the garden light coming through the window and no family present. Daniel had been there the night before. He had held the old man's hand for an hour while William slept, then driven home in the dark and made Lily breakfast before she woke up. He had not told anyone what William had shown him, the legal documents he had reviewed with his attorney, the decisions he had made quietly and without announcement. Daniel had known, for 3 weeks, that he was named in the will. He had tried, twice, to talk William out of it. William had simply said, "You don't get to decide what I do with what's mine." And that was that. The day the will was read, Clara sat in the offices of a downtown law firm, in a room that smelled of mahogany and old money. Around the table, the family's longtime attorney, 2 corporate trustees, a representative from the board of Whitmore Dynamics, and 2 distant relatives she saw at funerals. She was composed. She was always composed. She had not cried when she received the call about her father's death. She had felt something, a complicated, unnameable pressure behind her sternum, but she had not cried. She had flown back from a business trip, arranged the service through an assistant, and attended in the back of a black car that waited outside until it was over. She felt entitled to her coldness. She had earned it across 11 years of silence. She assumed the will was straightforward. She assumed full control of his personal estate and any remaining interest in the company. What she had not anticipated was the name the attorney read from the document with the same measured neutrality he brought to all names in all documents. Daniel Brooks, 40% of William Whitmore's personal liquid assets, full co-stewardship of the Whitmore Foundation, the family's charitable arm. The room went still in the specific way. Rooms go still when something genuinely unexpected has happened. Not the polite pause of surprise, but the airless quiet of shock. Clara heard her own breathing. She looked at the attorney. "Say that again," she said. He did. She stood before she knew she was standing. "A mechanic," she said. Her voice was flat and precise, which was more frightening than if she had raised it. "You are telling me that my father left half of his personal estate to a mechanic he met where? At a nursing home. Who arranged this? Who had access to him?" The attorney, a man who had seen many things in 30 years of estate law, maintained his composure. He reached across the table and slid a sealed envelope toward her. "Mr. Whitmore was specific that you receive this privately," he said. Clara took the envelope. She did not open it in the room. She walked out, past the receptionist, past the elevator, into a bathroom, where she stood with her back against the door for a full minute before she tore it open. The letter was 3 pages. Her father's handwriting, small, careful, slightly slanted to the left, covered every line. He wrote about the years he had been away. He did not try to justify them. He wrote about the decision he had made to come back into her orbit quietly, without demanding anything from her. He wrote about finding William, the irony, he noted, of an old man going undercover in his own twilight, and about the young man who had shown up at the auto shop one day for a simple repair and stayed for 4 years. He wrote, "Clara, Daniel Brooks visited me every night for the last 11 months of my life. He brought chess pieces and bad coffee from a machine in the lobby, and his full attention. He never once asked me for a thing. He never once knew, for most of those months, that I had anything to give. What he gave me, and I cannot explain this to you in legal language, because it has no legal language, was the experience of being known. Not as William Whitmore, the founder. Not as your father who failed. Just as an old man in a garden room who wanted someone to talk to." She read the next line twice. "If you want to understand the real value of a person, watch how they treat someone who cannot benefit them in any way. That is the only test that has never failed me. I wish I had understood it 30 years sooner." Clara folded the letter. She stood in the bathroom of the law firm for another 2 minutes. Then she went back out into the city and got into her car. And she told her driver to take her to the office, and she spent the rest of the day telling herself that this was a manipulation, that Daniel Brooks was a con artist who had befriended a lonely, wealthy old man and extracted a legacy from him with a calculation so slow and patient that it looked like kindness. She told herself she was going to find the evidence of it. She was going to expose it. She was going to fix this. She hired a firm that same week, not private investigators, exactly more of a discreet intelligence service that her company's legal team had used before for corporate due diligence. She gave them Daniel's full name, the name of his business, his address. She told them she needed a complete picture. She expected to find something. A pattern of cultivating elderly targets. Financial irregularities. Debts. Something. The first report came back after 10 days. It was 42 pages. Clara read it twice. It described a man who worked 6 days a week, sometimes 7. Who had no outstanding debts beyond a reasonable mortgage. Who had, in the year following his wife's death, quietly arranged to have his shop's parking lot repaved at his own cost, so that the elderly residents of the neighboring senior center could access the sidewalk more safely. Who had, on 17 documented occasions over the past 3 years, performed free repairs for customers who could not pay. Who had, every holiday season for 4 years, organized a food drive through his small community and personally delivered boxes to families the local food bank had identified as most in need. He did none of this publicly. There was no social media presence. No announcement. Just the thing, done, and then moving on. Clara set the report down. She picked it up again. She set it down again. There was nothing in it that helped her. There was nothing in it that made Daniel Brooks smaller, or more suspicious, or easier to dismiss. In fact, the report had done something that reports were not supposed to do. It had made her feel something. Not yet something she could name, but something. She drove out to his neighborhood on a Wednesday afternoon. She didn't tell anyone where she was going. She parked down the street from the shop and watched. The garage was a modest thing, 2 bays, a hand-painted sign, a row of potted plants along the front that looked recently watered. She could see Daniel through the open bay door, working on a truck. He was methodical, unhurried. At 2:15, a car pulled up and an older woman got out, moving carefully with a cane. Daniel straightened immediately, wiped his hands, went to her. He was smiling before he reached her. Clara watched them talk for several minutes. The woman laughed at something he said. He walked her inside, got her a chair, and went back to the car she'd brought in. He asked her twice if she needed water. At 3 o'clock, a yellow school bus stopped at the corner, and Lily came off it in her yellow sweater, always yellow. Clara would realize, always some shade of it, and ran to the garage with her backpack swinging. Daniel stopped what he was doing and caught her, just like that. Mid-sentence with a customer. Tools in hand, and he stopped everything to catch his daughter. They talked for a minute, her face turned up to his turned down. He pointed to something inside. She nodded seriously and went in. The customer he had been talking to was smiling. Everyone who came near Daniel Brooks seemed to end up smiling. Clara sat in her car and did not smile, but her hands were loose in her lap in a way they almost never were. She was still sitting there when a man in his 70s came out of the shop and paused next to her window. She startled. He looked at her without suspicion, just curiosity. "You waiting for service?" he asked. She said she was just passing through. He said, "Good shop, best in the county." That young man slept in the back bay 2 nights straight, once wouldn't leave, until he'd figured out how to cover my wife's hospital bill. Said the car had earned it. He tapped the roof of her car twice and walked away. Clara watched him go. Then she looked back at the garage, where through the window she could see Daniel explaining something to Lily at a workbench, pointing at a drawing she had made. Lily was nodding with absolute seriousness, like someone receiving important information. Clara watched for a long time after that, without quite being able to explain why she was still there. What broke open in Clara Whitmore happened not in a single moment, but across a span of weeks that felt, in retrospect, like water finding its way through stone, slow, patient, and by the time you noticed it, already deep. The breaking started, really, with a crisis. Whitmore Dynamics had been navigating a difficult quarter, a new AI product line running behind schedule, investor confidence wobbling when the floor dropped out completely. A financial journalist published a story with specific internal numbers that could only have come from inside the company. The markets reacted within hours. The board called an emergency session. Two major institutional investors signaled they were reconsidering their positions. Clara spent 72 hours in crisis mode, barely sleeping, managing every press response personally, while her communications team ran on coffee and fear. And somewhere in the middle of it, a name kept appearing in the audit trail of the leaked materials. Marcus Hale, her vice president of strategy. A man she had hired herself. A man who had been in her inner circle for 6 years. She didn't believe it at first. She made her team run the trace 3 times. The result was the same each time. Marcus Hale had been quietly sharing proprietary information with a competing firm for at least 18 months, not for money it turned out, but for a promised leadership role in the new company being built with the stolen technology. The betrayal was of such particular geometry, not a stranger, not an enemy, but a person she had trusted and promoted and defended in boardroom arguments, that Clara found herself unable to process it in her usual way. She sat in her office alone at 11 o'clock at night and found that she had no next move. Just the flat, stunned feeling of having been completely wrong about someone. She drove to Daniel's neighborhood. She had no clear reason. She had his address from the report. She sat in her car outside his house, a small beige thing with a lit kitchen window and a child's bicycle on the porch for 10 minutes before she got out. She knocked. He opened the door and looked at her with no expression of surprise, as though CEOs showed up at his door regularly. "Can I come in?" she asked. He stepped back. His kitchen smelled like soup and dish soap. There was a drawing on the refrigerator that said, "Daddy plus Lily plus son" in thick crayon. Clara sat at the small kitchen table and told him, with almost no preamble, about Marcus. About the leak. About the board. Daniel listened the way he always listened, fully, with his hands still and his eyes on her face. When she finished, there was a moment of quiet. "You're not here about Marcus," he said. "You're here because you want to know about your father." She looked at him. "Yes," she said. It was the first completely unguarded thing she had said to anyone in a long time. He told her about William. He started at the beginning, the carburetor, the coffee, the chess pieces, and he moved forward through 4 years of Tuesday and Thursday evenings with the same careful attention he brought to everything. He described her father not as a founder or a failure, but as a man complicated, regretful, genuinely funny when he was in the mood, proud of a daughter he watched from a distance and never stopped thinking about. "He kept your photo on his nightstand," Daniel said. "The one with the wildflower." Clara went very still. "He said you used to leave flowers by the kitchen window," Daniel continued. "He said he always saw them. He just didn't know how to come back." Clara said nothing. The room was very quiet. "He was proud of you," Daniel said. "He told me once that the company you'd built would outlast both of you. He said you had his stubbornness and your mother's intelligence, and that those 2 things together were a force of nature. He said it like it was the best thing he'd ever watched happen." Clara pressed her hands flat against the kitchen table. She looked at the refrigerator drawing. She asked, "Was he happy?" At the end, Daniel thought for a moment. "He was at peace," he said. "That's different." "But yes. I think so." She stayed for another hour. They talked about the board crisis, and Daniel, who had no corporate background and no stake in her company, asked questions that were unexpectedly precise and practically useful questions about transparency, about accountability, about what kind of company she actually wanted to run. At one point he said, "People forgive mistakes. What they don't forgive is when you make a mistake and then act like you didn't." She looked at him for a long moment. "Who taught you that?" she asked. He smiled. "Mostly trial and error," he said. It was the most honest answer she had heard in months. What followed was a week of the most intense collaboration Clara Whitmore had experienced outside of a product launch. Daniel, who had no MBA, no corporate title, no suit, turned out to think about problems with a clarity that cut through every layer of institutional overthinking. He helped her structure a framework for addressing the board, full transparency about the breach, a concrete accountability structure, a path forward that prioritized the company's employees over its stock price. He sat with her for 6 hours on a Friday night, Lily asleep in the next room, working through the communication strategy. He was patient. He was direct. He disagreed with her 3 times in ways that turned out to be correct. Clara noticed all of this. She filed it carefully in the part of herself that had always assessed people, but this time the assessment kept arriving at a conclusion she had no category for. Lily warmed to Clara in the unself-conscious way children warm to people who are genuinely paying attention to them. She showed Clara her drawings. She explained, at length, her current theory about why dinosaurs had probably been more nice than people think. She asked Clara once, with the directness of someone who had not yet learned to soften things, "Do you have kids?" Clara said no. Lily considered this. "Do you want them?" Clara said she wasn't sure. Lily nodded thoughtfully. "That's okay," she said. "My friend Avery's mom didn't want kids until she met Avery. Now she's the best mom." She went back to her drawing. Clara sat with that for a long time. It was during the second week when the crisis had begun to stabilize, and the board had, grudgingly, endorsed Clara's transparency plan, that Daniel handed her something he had been holding back. He had found, in the small box of documents William had given him along with the legal paperwork, a leather-bound journal. William's. He had not read past the first entry, he said, because he felt it wasn't his. "It belongs to you," he told Clara. She took it home. She read it in her apartment, sitting on her living room floor at 2 in the morning, and she read the entire thing. It was not a long journal William had written in it, only during the last 18 months of his life. But what it contained was a portrait, careful and unsparing, of a man reckoning with what he had done. He wrote about leaving the family, not as a defense, not as an explanation, but as a plain description of a failure of nerve. He wrote about watching Clara's career from the distance he had created. He wrote about Daniel. He has the kind of goodness that costs something. He doesn't have it because his life has been easy. He has it because he decided to. That is the rarest thing I have ever seen. And then, in the last entry, 5 days before he died, he wrote, "I left Clara a riddle. I hope she's patient enough to solve it. The answer isn't in the money. It never was." Clara sat on the floor of her apartment and cried. She had not cried like this since she was 9 years old. Sitting in the armchair by the door, she cried for the father she had decided, at some point, not to mourn because mourning meant admitting she had wanted something. She cried for the version of herself that had walked out of that Italian restaurant and felt righteous about it. She cried for Lily, who had heard every word and said nothing, and for Daniel, who had sat across from her that night and absorbed her judgment without flinching and without cruelty. She cried until there was nothing left, and then she sat in the quiet of her apartment and felt, for the first time in a very long time, like herself. She went to the garage the next afternoon. It was raining, a cold, steady November rain that made the city gray and specific. Daniel was under a car on the lift, visible only from the knees down. She walked in. He slid out when he heard footsteps. He looked at her for a moment, then stood up and wiped his hands on a shop rag. She stood in the bay door with the rain coming down behind her, and she said, "I owe you an apology." He waited. "I looked at you," she said, "and I saw what I had been taught to see. I saw what I was afraid of. And I used it to dismiss you so I could feel in control." She paused. "I was wrong, and I am sorry." She had practiced different versions of this on the drive over. In some of them she had been more articulate. In some she had led with the journal, with her father's words, with the logic of why she had changed her mind. But standing in front of him in that garage, with the rain coming in, and the smell of motor oil, and the sound of water on metal, all the prepared versions had collapsed, and what was left was the plain thing. She had been wrong. She was sorry. That was all of it. The garage was very quiet. The rain was loud. Daniel looked at her the way he had looked at her that first night. Not judging, just seeing. He was quiet for a long moment, long enough that she wondered if she had arrived too late. Then he said, "I hear you, and I believe you." He looked at the shop rag in his hands. "But I need you to understand that believing someone is sorry and trusting them again are two different things." "I'm not there yet." She nodded. "I know," she said. "I'm not asking you to be." She turned to go, then stopped. "The wildflowers," she said, without turning around. "My father saw them?" "Everyone," Daniel said. She walked back out into the rain. She did not push. She did not rush. Clara Whitmore, who had always moved forward like a force of physics, who had operated on the assumption that the right strategy applied hard enough would produce any outcome she wanted, learned. In those weeks, to wait. She volunteered 2 mornings a week at the Whitmore Foundation's new initiative for single-parent families, which she had personally redesigned in the wake of inheriting co-stewardship with Daniel. She showed up. She did the small work, driving families to appointments, organizing supply runs, sitting with people who just needed someone to sit with them. She was not particularly good at it at first. She was too efficient, too solution-oriented. But she got better. She started listening more and fixing less. Daniel watched all of this. He watched, without comment. He saw her at a foundation event one Saturday, kneeling on the floor of a community center to help a 5-year-old tie her shoes, talking to the child in a voice he had never heard her use, gentle, amused, entirely without performance. He saw her, a week later, spend 40 minutes on the phone with the foundation's legal team, fighting for a housing benefit for a single mother whose application had been wrongly denied. He saw her lose her temper, briefly, at the bureaucratic obstruction, and then collect herself and try again. He didn't say anything. He just noticed. One evening in December, Clara came to the house, not for a meeting, not with an agenda, just to bring dinner. She had made something, awkwardly, from a recipe she had found and practiced twice before getting it right. Daniel opened the door. She held up the container. "I made soup," she said. He looked at her. "You made soup," he repeated. "I did," she said. "It probably needs salt." He let her in. They ate at the small kitchen table. Lily ate with them, and then informed Clara, with great seriousness, that her soup was actually pretty good for a beginner. Clara laughed. It was a real laugh, unguarded, sudden, lighting up her whole face. Daniel watched it happen and felt something in himself settle. The way a thing that has been braced against impact settles when the impact doesn't come. After dinner, Lily was doing homework at the table. Clara was washing the bowls. Daniel came and stood in the kitchen doorway. "She would have liked you," he said quietly. Clara looked up. She knew he meant Maya. "I used to think," Lily said from the table, without looking up from her notebook, "that if Mommy was here, she'd be the same as Daddy. Like, really good at talking to people." She paused. "I think she'd like you because you're getting better at it." The kitchen was very quiet for a moment. Daniel looked at Lily with an expression too full to name. Clara set the bowl down carefully. She didn't trust herself to speak. Daniel said, softly, "Yeah, Bug, I think so too." Later, when Lily was in bed and the house was quiet, they sat on the porch in the cold air with 2 cups of coffee. Daniel reached over and took Clara's hand. He held it loosely, without announcement. She looked at their hands. She looked at the street. She didn't say anything. Neither did he. And that was exactly right. The board crisis resolved by January. Marcus Hale's full involvement was documented. And Clara made a public statement that the company's leadership review had revealed structural vulnerabilities she intended to address directly. She did not obscure the failure. She did not spin it. She described what had happened, what the consequences would be, and what Whitmore Dynamics would look like going forward. The markets responded better than her communications team had expected. A long profile in a business publication, one that Clara had not solicited and had agreed to only because the journalist had been persistent and honest, described her as a leader in the middle of a genuine transformation, and all the more credible for not pretending otherwise. She restructured the company over the following months with a thoroughness that surprised even her own board. New governance frameworks, employee review panels, a compensation structure that indexed executive bonuses partly to staff retention and satisfaction scores, not just revenue. She brought in a chief people officer whose background was in labor rights, which made two of her board members uncomfortable, and which Clara considered, privately, a sign she was on the right track. The Whitmore Foundation doubled its programming in the first year under her and Daniel's co-stewardship. They added a grief support program for widowed parents. They added a legal aid clinic for families navigating housing instability. They added, at Lily's suggestion, communicated through Daniel, a reading program for kids in underserved neighborhoods. Lily said the program should have good books, not boring ones. They made sure it did. Clara went to her father's grave on the anniversary of his death. She went alone. It was a gray morning, not yet fully light, and the cemetery was quiet. She stood in front of the stone for a long time. She had brought wildflowers, the same kind she used to leave in the cup by the kitchen window, the ones her father had always seen. She set them down carefully. She arranged them the way she used to arrange things as a child, with a particular attention to detail that had always been hers, a fastidiousness that her mother had praised as neatness, and that she now understood was also love, expressed in the only language she had had at 9 years old. Then she stood back up and looked at his name, cut into the granite, and said, in a voice barely above a whisper, "I understand now. The money wasn't the gift. You knew that. I just needed time to learn it." She stood there for a while longer. A bird landed nearby and then was gone. The city was beginning to wake up somewhere beyond the trees. She felt, standing in that quiet, like someone who had finally read the last page of a book she had been carrying for 30 years without opening. Not happy, exactly. Something better. Complete. What William Whitmore had left his daughter was not, in the end, a legal document. It was not a sum. It was not even a man. Though Daniel Brooks had turned out to be more than she had any right to expect after the way she had first looked at him, what William had left her was the chance to see herself clearly. To stand in a room where she had no authority and no leverage and no title, and find out what she was made of when those things were stripped away. He had arranged, with the patience of a man who had run out of time, a situation in which his daughter would have to look at a life built entirely out of the things she had decided didn't count, and decide what they were actually worth. Daniel, Clara, and Lily walked along the lakeshore on a Sunday morning in February, the kind of morning where the cold is clean and the light off the water is extraordinary, and the city behind you feels far enough away to breathe. Lily was running ahead, tracking something in the sand, a pattern she had seen, and decided needed investigation, because Lily considered nearly everything to be worth investigating. Daniel and Clara walked beside each other with their shoulders close, the way people walk when they have stopped needing to manage the distance between themselves. Clara was thinking about the quarterly projections. She was also thinking about nothing. Both of these were true at the same time, which would not have seemed possible to her 2 years ago. The old Clara would have found the empty space intolerable, would have filled it immediately with strategy, with planning, with some forward motion that disguised itself as purpose. The Clara, walking this lakeshore on this February morning, had learned, slowly and with some difficulty, that presence was its own kind of purpose. Daniel said, "Lily wants to know if you're coming for her school play next Friday." Clara said, "I'll rearrange the 3:30. He nodded. "She's playing a tree," he said. "She's very committed to the role." Clara said, "Of course she is." She said it warmly, which was new, and she did not catch it or put it away. There are people who enter our lives and, through their presence alone, make us reckon with who we have chosen to be. Not through confrontation, not through argument, just through the simple, consistent fact of themselves, the way they carry their lives, the way they treat the cashier and the elder and the child, the way they show up every time without needing to be asked. Clara Whitmore had built an empire on the principle that value was measurable, that worth was quantifiable, that the right metrics applied to the right data would produce the right answer. And then, a man with grease on his hands and a daughter who wore yellow and a dead king on a chessboard had walked into the margins of her life and taught her the only equation that mattered. Not what a person owns, not what a person has achieved, not where they live or what degree they hold or what their name produces when typed into a search engine, but who they are, when they have nothing to offer and nothing to gain, when no camera is watching and no audience is waiting, and the only reason to do the right thing is that it is the right thing. That is the whole of it. That is the only test that doesn't lie. And sometimes if you are very lucky, or very brave, or both, you fail at first, and stumble badly, and say the sharp thing and walk out of the restaurant and feel nothing. And then life gives you the chance to go back, to stand in the rain in front of someone you have wronged, to say the true thing plainly, with your hands empty and your titles left in the car. Clara Whitmore got that chance. She took it, and in taking it, she found that her father had been right all along, not about money, not about legacy, not about any of the hard business of succession and inheritance. He had been right about the only thing that matters, that the greatest thing you can leave someone is not what you built. It is the moment when they finally understand how to build something real themselves. The person who changes your entire life, she told an audience the following spring. Standing at a podium, at a foundation benefit, speaking without notes in front of 400 people who had come expecting a corporate speech and were receiving something else entirely, might not be the one who looks the part, might not have the right address or the right resume or the right anything that you have been told to require. The person who changed mine fixed cars for a living, raised his daughter alone, and visited an old man in a care home every night for years for nothing. For absolutely nothing, but the fact that someone needed him to show up. She paused. He is the most successful person I have ever met. It just took me a while to understand what success actually means. Daniel was sitting in the third row. He was not looking at the podium. He was watching Lily, who was in the row ahead of him, who had fallen asleep against the shoulder of the woman next to her, a foundation volunteer, who was now gently adjusting so the child was more comfortable. He saw Clara glance at Lily from the stage, and then look at him, and he smiled. And she smiled back. And it was the simplest thing in the world.